Welcome to a new episode of Sustainability Forward. It's probably one of the last episodes for the year, but we are very excited because we have, of course, my co-host Carmine, but also a returning guest on our podcast episode today. Carmine, welcome to you, and would you please also introduce our guests?
Thank you, Rishi. Yes, we are very happy today to have back Andrew Prag coming back again to the show. Andrew is the Managing Director for Policy at We Mean Business Coalition. It's a global non-profit coalition working in the world's most influential businesses to accelerate action on climate change. He oversees the coalition policy engagement, work both internationally and across key countries. Andrew has 20 years experience across the energy and environmental fields, spanning public and private sectors. Prior to joining the coalition, he held a number of different roles at the OECD and the International Energy Agency, including a head of horizontal climate initiative at the OECD and a head of a environment and climate change unit. He has worked extensively on climate policy, including close engagement with the UN climate negotiations and the G7 and the G20 processes. Previously, Andrew worked on climate and energy issues in private sectors, including with Camco Clean Energy and the Royal Dutch Shell. He holds a Master of Science in Environmental Technology from Imperial College London and a Master of Arts in Natural Sciences from Cambridge University in UK. Welcome back, Andrew.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back with you again. A year has gone by very fast.
Yes.
Yes, indeed it has. So, Andrew, obviously, last time we had you was when you had gone to Dubai for the last COP, and again, you're coming back from yet another COP, and between those two, a year has gone by. But before we get into the topic of COP itself, let me ask you a little bit about what you're doing at We Mean Business Coalition. From a branding perspective, I find the name really, really cool. We mean business, but it'd be good to get a little bit of perspective on that from your side.
Sure, thank you, and I'm glad you like the name. It was invented 10 years ago now. Actually, we just celebrated our 10th birthday, because this coalition was brought together a year before the COP that became the Paris Agreement, and because it was realized at the time by existing progressive business organizations that there was a need to really rally the business voice into one place to have a kind of overarching coalition that would make their message from business that they did want to push for a stronger climate policy and stronger outcomes. It would make that more effective to be under one organization. So that's where we were founded. And since then, we've really been bringing this voice always of the more ambitious end of the business sector and trying to make that heard in policymaking circles. So be it in the UN at the COP process, but also G20, G7, also in domestic capitals, and very important in policymaking processes, to make sure that they hear that there is a section of the private sector that's trying to go faster and wants to see the policies to help them go faster. So that's what we do. And before the COP last year, the one in Dubai, so we initiated this big campaign from businesses called Fossil to Clean, which is showing that there is a business voice pushing governments to accelerate the transition away from fossil fuels. So that had quite an impact last year, and we've been really scaling and developing that campaign since then to keep pushing policy in the right direction.
Excellent. And I remember we had quite a bit of discussion around this topic in our last episode. So let me, for a moment, go back to COP28 in Dubai last year. And when you came back, we had a discussion on these commitments to tripling renewable capacity, doubling energy efficiency, and this whole move to transition away from fossil fuels. I remember these, even in the media, these news items appeared sort of as quite prominently, and so that was very interesting last year. Plus, you talked about the scrutiny on national contributions as well. Compared to what you saw in Dubai and what you saw in Baku this year, what progress was made between these two COPs?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's good to have that kind of retrospective on where we were last year and where we are this year, and also where we're going next year. It's important to keep that perspective too. Because I mean, the big issue on the table this year was around climate finance and the climate finance that developed countries are providing for developing countries. We'll come back to that in a moment. But so that was really occupying the sort of main headlines. But at the same time, there was a push to have a new text that reiterated and doubled down on the commitments made last year. So which were many in this, what was called the UAE consensus last year. And it included these elements on notably tripling renewables, doubling energy efficiency, and very importantly, the commitment and transition away from fossil fuels, with a line that talked about accelerating action this decade. So these are important commitments. And what's quite striking is, with all the focus on the climate finance, in the end, there was actually no outcome at this COP on these major energy transition issues, which on the face of it sounds quite shocking. And the reason for that was that there was, in fact, a small group of countries, the ones who are the most dependent on fossil fuels, who were quite actively trying to water down the text and sort of weaken it from the position it got to last year. And what happened on the final day was that the more progressive countries who wanted to move forward actually rejected that text and said, look, it's actually better to have nothing than a watered down one, because what that means is that last year's text still stands, and that is quite ambitious and has these breakthroughs that we just talked about. And so it's important that even though they didn't agree a new outcome on these issues of the energy transition elements, the onus is on countries now to, as they develop their new national climate plans, which they have to do in the next few months and by next year at the latest, the onus is on them to respect what was agreed last year in terms of how they interpret these goals on renewable energy, energy efficiency, fossil fuels, and others on electrifying transportation. There are several different elements to it. So no further outcome on these energy transition goals, but the onus is on countries to make sure that they come good on that in their national climate plans. That said, there were some other breakthroughs that are relevant. So there was finally an agreement to operationalize the carbon market mechanisms that were established under the Paris Agreement 9 years ago, and have gone through a lot of negotiations since then. And finally, this time, they adopted the final parts of the rulebook and the standards required to create methodologies for these mechanisms, so that market can now get underway and be created, which is a useful boost for carbon markets. It's quite a difficult time. And then there were some agreements also sort of off the negotiations, countries coming together to agree on specific issues. So this time there's one notably on the great enablers of the energy transition. So on improving electricity storage capacity and on building out and modernizing electricity grids, which are two sort of not really background, but are two sort of underlying issues which are absolutely essential if we want to see this transition from fossil fuels towards clean energy. So, a number of countries came together and signed this pledge to scale up the storage and the grid. So that was another thing that happened there. But yeah, in short, while most of the focus was on the climate finance stuff, there was this kind of fight happening over the energy transition, which in the end had no outcome, which is better than a weak outcome, is how I'd put it.
Yeah. And there was a lot of discussion entering this COP about a deal on climate finance. We knew that this COP was a figure COP in terms of finance. Now, closing it, significant criticism has emerged from developing countries, especially on slow delivery of this climate financing. Do you see that on the ground, and any attempt to mitigate that?
Well, yes. So, this has always been the kind of key issue at the heart of these multilateral negotiations, which have been going on for nearly 30 years, and more than 30 years, actually, if you go right back to when the convention was signed. So the fact around the relative responsibilities of different countries, depending on their level of development, and the responsibility for developed countries not only to take the lead in mitigating emissions, accelerating the transition, but also in providing resources and mobilizing finance and investment for the needs of developing countries. So this has always been an absolutely contentious issue at the heart of these negotiations. And it really rose to a head this year because it was the deadline for countries to agree on a new commitment for developed countries to provide the finance. Because as you said, the last one was delivered far too slowly. It was commitment made, we first talked about actually way back in 2009 in Copenhagen, but then was kind of formalized under the Paris Agreement for developed countries to provide 100 billion US dollars per year. In the language, it's provided and mobilized, which is important because it means it's not just bilateral development finance or public finance from developed countries. It's also ways that that public finance is used to scale up private sector investment. So that's what's called mobilizing the private sector investment by smart deployment of public finance to help de-risk projects in developing countries, to bring down the cost of capital, to make it easier for private firms to invest and so on. So they had this commitment for $100 billion per year by 2020. And it was delivered late. And that caused a lot of conflict and mistrust, as you said, Carmine. So finally, according to the OECD, where I used to work, and they're the kind of leaders on calculating these financial flows, 2022, finally, the 2020 amount was reached, this famous 100 billion. But they had agreed already that this year, in 2024, they would agree the new deal to come into force already from 2025. So it was really no time to delay it. This deal had to be struck at this COP, and it was very difficult negotiation because developed countries, of course, have very stretched public budgets already. They're dealing, with difficult political issues at home, the rise of populism, the cost of living crisis still biting, and so it's not like they have enormous wallets to open up from public finance to side. But at the same time, developing countries said, well, look at the costs which are escalating in our countries, not only the costs that it will be for them to transition to a completely clean energy system and to reduce deforestation and meet their net zero goals, but also to adapt and become resilient to the impacts of climate change. So the expectations were far apart in that, developing countries were talking about, more than $1 trillion required per year by 2035, which they said should be provided by developed countries, whereas the developed countries said, look, we already struggled to mobilize 100 billion, so how can we step it up to more than $1 trillion? So these were very far apart negotiating positions, and it was a very fraught negotiation. But they did come out with a deal at the end of the day, which is slightly confusing to understand, but essentially it sets an overarching goal of mobilizing $1.3 trillion per year by 2035 for developing countries, which is a huge number, of course. And we can come back to that, the composition of that, if you like. But importantly, within that, there's a sort of wedge of it of 300 billion US dollars per year, which is the responsibility of the developed countries. Again, not only public finance, it talks about public and private sources, but it's this big step up from the 100 billion, of course. And it's important that it's couched in terms of this enormous number of 1.3 trillion. And we can talk a bit more about the roadmap to get there, because it's certainly not easy, for sure.
Okay, I mean, let's maybe talk about that a little bit more. And also, Andrew, what other commitments stood out at this COP? I mean, last year, I remember as soon as COP started, you could see the press full of the commitments that were made. But I saw that sort of lacking a little bit. Was that your observation as well?
It was a bit of a different approach, but there were some actually very notable commitments which were steps forward made on these new national climate plans. So these are the NDCs in the jargon, nationally determined contributions. So this is kind of the bedrock of the Paris Agreement, that countries have to put forward every 5 years a new national climate plan for around 10 years hence. So at this time, they have to, by next year, put forward their plans for 2035, because they already have ones on the table for 2030. And there's the deadline is technically in February next year, because it's 9 months before the COP30, the one next year, which is a big landmark one, and maybe we can talk about that at the end. But what was interesting at this COP is some of the countries used this COP to come forward and step up and say, look, here's my new commitment for my new national climate plan for 2035, which they didn't have to do at this COP. That was, the deadline was not this COP, but they chose the moment to do that, which really galvanized things and put a lot of energy into the process. So, noticeably the UK. So at the start of the COP, when there was the heads of state were there at what they call the World Leaders Summit, the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, made this new commitment for an 81% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions for the UK by 2035, which is an ambitious number in line with what the science demands and is quite impressive. So that really stood out. And then notably Brazil, who are the hosts of next year's COP in COP30, which they said is the kind of landmark for these new climate plans having been announced. So they wanted to lead and show the world that they're not only hosting, they're leading. So they put forward their new national climate plan as well, which has a range of number between 59 and 67% reduction, which is a rather large range, it must be said. But if they do push for the upper end of that range, then that is also a very ambitious target. So these were notable commitments that really gave energy back to the process, because we haven't mentioned it yet, but it goes without saying maybe that this whole COP was happening in the aftermath of the US election outcome, which, of course, the big blow to the sort of momentum around climate action internationally. We all know what Donald Trump's policies are in this area. So it was very important that some of these other countries stood up and said, we are carrying on. This is not an issue that's dictated by any one country. The momentum is there internationally. This energy transition is happening. It's good business, makes economic sense, and that was very important. So it was good to see those countries stepping up and showing that even if the US is going to change tack, the rest of the world is pushing on.
Yeah, and looking ahead, Andrew, what needs to be done to translate these goals of this COP, this specific COP, into the reality? What's your view?
So it's two things I would say. So firstly, the making sure that these new national climate plans, the NDCs, are from all the big countries, strong, ambitious, well designed, and implementable. And I'll come back to that in a second. So that's the first thing. And the second one is then really showing how this new finance goal is going to be met, and what it looks like on the ground for developing countries. So I would say those are kind of the two big topics. For the national climate plans, what we have been saying as We Mean Business, and we put out this, what we call our call to action for ambitious and investable NDCs, climate plans. So we put this out a few months ago, and we've really been pushing countries on this and are developing it further now for particular countries to show what it looks like in their country. What does it mean from the private sector perspective for a climate plan to be investable, to really drive that essential investment from the private sector? Because this is really the key question. If we're going to really translate the goals of this COP into reality, as you asked, it has to come through the form of these national climate plans. And that means, in the way we frame it in our call to action, it means, firstly, the target, sort of overarching target and the direction of travel and everything that's laid out in the announcement of the climate plan is very important, as that sets the signal. It shows the private sector that the direction of travel is set, that this is absolutely a serious change of approach and launching this kind of transformation. So that's important. But what we say is that what's equally important is the translation of that into real policy measures. So having the actual policy frameworks and the kind of follow through from the commitment into policy measures on the ground, which really drive business investment. So, it's good to have an ambitious target, but if that doesn't translate into real incentives and tax credits and regulations and carbon pricing and all the other elements which actually drive investment, then it's only a target and it's not enough. So our message is really that, if we're going to translate this to reality, we need the countries to come forward with strong targets and clear climate plans, but they also need to show how they're translating that into policy if they want to make these things genuinely kind of investable and set the chart for transforming economies into new, clean, competitive economies and so on. So that's on the climate plans. And then, as I said, the second point is on how to make this very big new climate finance deal a reality. And that's really where a lot has to be done to improve how we use the public climate finance to mobilize private sector finance. And that's this element of de-risking that I mentioned earlier. So, it's great that we've seen this very strong growth in clean energy investment around the world in the last few years. Solar power is booming, wind power is booming, electric vehicles, energy storage, batteries, and everything is growing fast, and that's great. But when you look at the distribution around the world, it's like 85%, I think, more than 85% is in essentially the developed countries plus China. And only 15% of that new growth is going to the rest of the world. So in African countries, South America, everywhere else. So that is a big issue, and that this climate finance, the public climate finance, really has to be designed to address that and look at how it can be used most effectively to make the investment conditions better in those countries for clean energy and other transition technologies. So, about new guarantee schemes, about other forms of de-risking, just to sort of look at how you can bring down the cost of capital to encourage better private sector investment in those countries. So that's a big part of making this climate finance deal a reality.
Also, because Andrew, is not just to have Global South, that is called today, to leapfrog these kind of technologies, but also put in place the funding to make it happen. Also, this climate mitigation plan that doesn't have forcefully probably high ROI in financial terms, but they are extremely needed by some of the most vulnerable countries, and they need this kind of public finance available to put these mitigation actions in place.
Absolutely, yeah. But also to do that while they're being hit by these increasingly strong climate impacts, right? So you talked about the vulnerability. It's these many cases of global South developing countries. There's these are countries where investment conditions have always been harder. It's there's country risk factors, there's political risk factors.
Yeah,
it's harder to invest, and at the same time, they're also more vulnerable to these increasingly intense climate impacts, be it extreme weather events, increasing droughts, changes in water availability, and so on. So there's really a double challenge to use the public finance to really do better at adapting and becoming more resilient to those climate impacts at the same time as funding the transition. And the two are of course linked. You need to think about the changing climate conditions when designing renewable energy, because a lot of renewable energy sources are essentially weather dependent, be it on wind or on water or on solar. And so designing them to a way that is realistic to the way the climate is changing is very important and has to be part of that kind of integrated planning.
Interesting. One of the questions, Andrew, that Carmen and I debate often is about the future of COPs, and I'm curious to hear from your perspective as to whether the COP is going to remain the platform that brings together all these parties on this topic. Do you see it to remain, more or less the same, or do you expect a major change in the shape and form of COPs going forward?
Yeah, it's a great question, really interesting one, and there's really lively debate on this at the moment, I find. Because some people say, well, look, we've been doing these COPs for 30 years. The action, they have made a difference, of course they have, but the action has been too slow. It's the urgency, the severe urgency of what climate science now shows. This COP process is not delivering. How can we do things faster and so on? So there are a lot of voices about this. My view is, firstly, the multilateralism is absolutely essential. This is a global problem. Famously, real problem with the global commons more than any other probably, and you absolutely have to have every country in the world in the room to be discussing this. And given how kind of fractious the global geopolitics are at the moment, we have to cherish these opportunities we have through the United Nations to bring together all countries of the world to actually talk and advance on these issues. It's the sort of thing that you don't realize how important it was when you've lost it, because given how much tension and conflict there is around the world at the moment, it's vital that we keep these multilateral channels moving. So my bottom line is that we absolutely need these COP processes to keep going, because they are this essential kind of multilateral channel. That said, we do need to look at reforming them and improving them. So what's happening over time is naturally the COPs are moving more towards a forum for talking about the implementation, rather than just negotiating the rules. And that's evident in these new national climate plans, and we need to move towards a COP process which really is helping to facilitate countries in becoming more ambitious and making good on their commitments and really delivering on their plans. And there's definitely some reforms that can be done to facilitate that. One way is actually how we think about the so-called non-state actors, which means essentially everyone who's not a national government, because this process has always been very much a sovereign state, national government-led process, which makes sense, of course. But if we're going to really tackle climate change properly, then we need everyone on board, and that includes the subnational governments, the city governments, and then very importantly the private sector, who we of course represent. So there's a lot of thinking going on about how to better integrate these so-called non-state actors in the process. We've had this thing called the Marrakesh Partnership for the last several years, trying to bring in the voices of key actors in the sort of non-state actor world, but that's just been renewed. But we really need to think about how to integrate these voices even more into the process, while making sure that they are the ambitious ones, of course, because there are elements of the private sector who would want to slow down this process. We can't just open the doors to having lobbyists for the fossil fuel industry sort of throwing everything off course. But if you set the criteria right and allow the access only for companies with proven transition plans and proven evidence that they are dead set on making this transition and pushing the policy in the right direction, then they can bring a lot to help facilitate the government progress on this. So yeah, there's a long answer, but in short, my take is we desperately need this COP process to continue, because we have to cherish this multilateralism in such a conflictual world as we have at the moment. But we have to look at how we improve them, including on the better representation of the non-state actors.
And thank you, Andrew. So just summarize, you're just saying is a world with COP is still better than a world without COP.
Yes.
Going forward, definitely, we agree. And we're looking forward for Belém, as you said, for next year. There's a lot of expectation from going back to the country where everything started in 1992.
That's right.
With the 3 COPs. And one final question, how do you imagine these 3 COPs that happen? So the one on climate change, the one on biodiversity, the one on land, coming together, converging together in one single COP?
Yeah, it's an interesting idea. I think there are a lot of overlapping issues, of course, between the 3. So formally it's the desertification one, the biodiversity one, and the climate change one. And it's increasingly recognized, for example, that we can't, you can't solve the climate change problem without massively improving the preservation of nature and biodiversity. And in fact, vice versa. If climate change runs ravage, then you can't hope to protect biodiversity. And so, the issues are very interlinked. Given that they're all, the 3 of them are all sort of quite heavy bureaucratic processes in their own right, it may be too much of a sort of bureaucratic effort to actually merge them. But having, sort of overarching events or summits that help to bring together all these issues. We have, for example, the original Rio summit was obviously founding all of these issues and sort of anchoring sustainable development. And then there's been every 10 years a sort of stock take summit on what's sort of Rio plus 10, 20 and so on. So maintaining that it's not about merging the processes, but making sure there are moments where it's very clear that the 3 are intertwined and essential for moving forward these issues together. And then you talked about Belém next year. So famously, it's a city in the Amazon region of Brazil. So Brazil really chose that as their host city for the climate COP. It's COP30, it's the climate change process. But there will inevitably be quite a strong focus on nature, reducing deforestation, land degradation kind of issues because of where it is. They deliberately chose it in the Amazon to highlight those issues and those interlinkages. So we envisage next year COP30 being very much a twin track thing. So there's big focus on the transition away from fossil fuels and the energy transition, but at the same time recognizing the importance of really working on reducing deforestation, particularly tropical forests, and also then just generally the links between climate and protecting nature and biodiversity. So I think we'll see them coming together more next year just because of that emphasis that Brazil is putting on it. Yeah,
definitely. Andrew, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful discussion. Thank you for bringing your experience, direct experience from what happened in Baku, your thoughts, and also we really enjoyed learning more about what you're doing at the Women Business Coalition. Thank you so much, Andrew.
My pleasure. It's been a great conversation. Really happy to join you.
Excellent. I hope this episode provided to our audience a view into COP, just like we did last year, even if some of them may not have been able to follow COP or be there in person. I hope this episode provided a bit of a summary of everything that went on. As always, very thankful for all your subscriptions, your playing the episodes, even some of the past episodes. I find that as we get towards the end of the year, I always look up for some of my favorite episodes from some of my favorite podcasts. So I encourage our audience to also do the same with some of the greatest hits of the Sustainability Forward podcast. We are all on all major platforms such as Spotify, Apple Podcasts, as well as on YouTube. And on LinkedIn, you can find us under the banner Sustainability Forward. Carmine, thank you for joining me. Andrew, thank you again.
Thank you, Rishi.
Thank you very much.
Talk soon.